Previously, we talked about looking at different empirical studies and making sense of these studies. In this session, we will look specifically at quantitative studies. We will take the first steps towards making sense of a quantitative study. So previously, we said that in evaluating the empirical article, we try to identify these questions. What is the research purpose? What is the relationship being explored? Identifying antecedents and outcomes. Visually representing the relationship if it is not already expressed in the paper. Examining what population was studied and what were the findings. We are going to use this paper as an example of a quantitative study. So the title is Inclusive Leadership and Team Innovation. So just from the title, we have a clear understanding of the constructs being studied. It goes on to say the role of team voice and performance pressure. So we understand that the main constructs are inclusive leadership and team innovation. But we are also looking at how team voice and performance pressure influence that relationship. We are making sense of the study just from the title. Now we go to the abstract. And we see that there is a background given for the study. And we also see that a moderation mediation model is being used to examine the relationship between inclusive leadership and team innovation. We see that a hierarchical regression analysis was used for analysis, and the data came from 2 survey-based field studies. All right, so there is also a note about the findings, but right now, let's look at the rest of the article first. So as in any research paper, there is an introduction that talks about innovation, its impact on creativity. It talks about different theories and so on. So this provides a good introduction to the study. The second section is about the theoretical background and hypothesis development. As we have discussed before, hypotheses are very important in quantitative studies. It is through theory, it is from the literature that you make a hypothesis for the population you are studying. So in that spirit, this paper starts with inclusive leadership and team innovation. What are the 2 constructs being studied here? The first construct is inclusive leadership. The second construct is team innovation. Okay. So the article goes on to talk about team innovation, how it is a complex process, and how the type of leadership impacts team innovation. So they provide literature and other studies on that have been published on that relationship. Good. So as you go down, you see that they have used the literature on the relationship between inclusive leadership and team innovation to make a suggestion that because theory suggests all of this, they propose the hypothesis that inclusive leadership is positively associated with team innovation. Okay, so as you can see in the hypothesis here, there is a relationship that is proposed between two constructs, the first construct being inclusive leadership and the second construct being team innovation. In addition to the relationship, they are also hypothesizing that relationship will be positive, which means that as inclusive leadership increases, team innovation is expected to increase. So a positive relationship is being hypothesized. So if we were to visually represent that, we say that inclusive leadership impacts team innovation. Okay, so we are hypothesizing, or they are hypothesizing, that inclusive leadership impacts team innovation positively. As one increases, the other increases. So a correlation analysis can help understand whether the two of them are related. A regression analysis is able to say whether one predicts the other. To what extent does team innovation change depending on change in inclusive leadership? That is what a regression analysis can do. So in this example, inclusive leadership leads to team innovation. Inclusive leadership is an antecedent to team innovation. Team innovation is an outcome of inclusive leadership. Okay, so you understand antecedent and outcome as well. These are terms that you will use often in quantitative research. Another way to think about it is inclusive leadership is the independent variable and team innovation is the dependent variable. Inclusive leadership can impact team innovation. Team innovation is dependent on inclusive leadership. So team innovation is the dependent variable, inclusive leadership is the independent variable. If we keep coming down this article, after H1, the next section is about the mediating role of team voice. So in this section, they talk about voice behavior and they go on to talk about how voice impact can trigger innovation and how voice can, how other studies have looked at how inclusive leadership can result in increased employee voice. So they conclude the section after looking at theories and the literature on the topic to say that they predict, right? The hypothesis is that they predict a positive relationship between inclusive leadership and team team innovation, which is mediated by team voice. So team voice is a mediator in the relationship between inclusive leadership and team innovation. So if we were to go back to how we visually represented the relationship between inclusive leadership and team innovation, the mediation further states that team voice is a mediating variable between inclusive leadership and team innovation, right? And so what that means is that team voice is explaining how team innovation occurs through inclusive leadership. And they are saying that because of inclusive leadership, team voice is enhanced. And because team voice is enhanced, team innovation increases. So as you can see, team voice is the intermediary variable, right? Or it is an explanatory variable that explains the relationship between the independent variable of inclusive leadership and the dependent variable of team innovation. In this article, as you can see, after hypothesis 2, the next section is about the moderating role of performance pressure. Again, as you can see, there is literature that is cited to support how performance pressure might impact this relationship. And in summary, these arguments suggest the third hypothesis, which is that performance pressure moderates the relationship between inclusive leadership and team voice such that the positive relationship is stronger under high pressure conditions and lesser under low pressure conditions. So if we were to visually represent that, it would look like this. The relationship between inclusive leadership and team leadership is moderated by performance pressure, right? So this visual representation of moderation helps us understand that relationship. When performance pressure is higher, they are expecting the impact of inclusive leadership on team voice to be stronger. So the moderating variable decides or gives a sense of how strong that relationship is going to be. In some cases, it could even change the direction of the relationship between the two variables. In this paper, they have done a good job of visually representing all these variables by showing all these 5 variables with team voice as the mediating variable between inclusive leadership and team innovation, and performance pressure as the moderating variable between inclusive leadership and team voice. If we look back at the main elements of an empirical paper that we want to identify, in addition to the constructs that are being studied and the relationship that's being studied, which are represented in the hypothesis, we also want to understand an overview of methods. What is the population? What is the sample? And how was it studied? So here we see that there are two field studies with multi-source data from team members and their leaders in China. Okay, that's how this was studied. And then if we look further, we see that data were collected from two companies operating in two industries located in a southern province in China. Okay, so it's important to see what was the sample for the study, and it has been described there. At this stage, we are not looking at much more than that, but as you become more and more familiar with understanding the components of a research study, we will look into more details of data collection. I will highlight, though, that here, in this case, we are talking about inclusive leadership. So just let us highlight how inclusive leadership was measured. That's very important, okay? Any quantitative study that is measuring a construct, you want to understand how is that construct studied? What was the construct validity and so on, you will learn about in future courses. But here you see that inclusive leadership was measured using a 9-item scale developed by Carmelli and others. So you know that Carmelli and others have developed a scale. It's cited here, so you can look at the study to see the psychometric properties of that scale. But for now, you know that Carmelli and others' 9-item scale was used to measure inclusive leadership. Similarly, the other constructs were measured using other scales. The other thing I want to show you is data analysis. So here they say exploratory factor analysis was done for descriptive statistics, and then LISREL was used for confirmatory factor analysis. Okay, and then hierarchical regression analysis was used to test the moderated mediation effect and confirm the findings from the regression analysis. A bootstrap test with 1,000 samples was conducted using process macro. So all these are good notes to make to understand data analysis conducted for the study. The results offered here are the results of the statistical analysis that were performed. We are not going to go into that in much detail now, but what I would encourage you to do is make sure that you read the discussion to really understand the interpretation of those findings. Did the statistical analysis confirm the hypothesis, or was the hypothesis rejected? So I would encourage you to read the discussion section to understand what were the findings from the study. I know we discussed the study and looked at all the constructs, but we also want to see how did they actually articulate the purpose of the study. And some papers do a good job of actually articulating it very clearly. A good paper should always articulate either in terms of the purpose of the study is to, and specifically state the purpose of the research study, or the aim of the study is to. So in this particular paper, if you can see, in the introduction, after the first few paragraphs where they have discussed the concepts, they go on to say, to summarize, the central purpose of the present study is to conceptually clarify and empirically examine the core question on whether, how, and when inclusive leadership is related to team innovation. Do you see that? So earlier we had talked about the different components of an empirical study, and we said that we want to identify the purpose of a study clearly. So now we have identified all that we said we would in an empirical study. We identified the research purpose. We looked at the relationships being explored, right? The relationship between inclusive leadership and team innovation. We identified what is the antecedent and what is the outcome. And we were able to visually represent, but the paper also visually represented the relationships being explored. We looked at the population that was studied, and we looked at the section in which the findings are discussed. So to wrap up, we were able to look at an empirical paper, in this case a quantitative study, and skim through the paper to identify the most important parts: the research purpose, the constructs, the relationships being explored, the population, and finally the findings.